So read, stuck on the block, read, sitting in the box, read. What's going on, people? This week is a special, but I'm going to try and keep it brief, 5-minute mark or below. This is what we're going to call the immigration special. People in Britain are always going on about immigration. This is apparently the biggest political issue in Britain. And people think they're really original, whinging about immigration and whinging about immigrants. A country that has been one of the largest source of immigrants in the world, a country that colonized the quarter of the planet, sees absolutely no irony whatsoever in constantly claiming that immigrants are coming over here, taking our jobs, stealing our resources, and of pretending some groups of people are immigrants and some others are not. So we're just going to give you, my 3 favorite books on the history of immigration in Britain and why. Number 1 is The Battle of Britishness, Migrant Journeys, 1685 to the present by Tony Kushner. This is probably the best, the most well-written of the book, the most kind of storytelling of the 3 books. So the most enjoyable read. It isn't my favorite of the 3 for no fault of the book itself, but there's one particular book that I'm going to show you in a minute. It's probably my favorite just because it lays out very plainly, what a lot of the motivation for immigration policy has been. But this book shows really, a complex way in which Britain has received different groups of migrant people, going all the way back to the Huguenots till now. I just want to read a couple of quotes from it that I really thought were interesting. So it's talking about, the idea of aliens and stuff like that in the early part. In the years before 1914, fears of alien subversion and criminality grew following incidents such as the Houndstitch murders and the siege of Sydney Street in 1910, 1911. Those were both perceived to be or perpetrated by quote-unquote Jewish people, and there was a lot of kind of anti-Jewish or anti-alien sentiment in that period. Those crimes, the idea of collective blame, even then, in the early period, part of the 20th century, became really fashionable to collectively blame entire groups of people for individual acts. After the war, 250,000 Belgian refugees, including children, were quickly and unceremoniously returned home by the British state. Indeed, a repatriation committee was set up as early as 1917. So this sort of, tradition of being hostile toward people coming to the country while facilitating, British emigrants to go abroad is very, very long, well over a century, but I just found those quotes quite interesting. And even certain sections of the press have consistently for over 100 years been part of the anti-immigrant tradition. So, for example, on page 145, British officials were also worried about providing ammunition to the vocal anti-alien press in Britain. The Daily Express, as we have seen with regard to the Kindertransport, was one of the most virulent in its antipathy toward the refugees in the mainstream media. Indeed, the Daily Express had maintained an anti-alien stance since its formation during the 1900s. It echoed Peake's comments with regard to the St. Louis that the example must not be repeated. There was, quote, no room for any more refugees in this country. If we give refugees a home in this country, they become a burden and a grievance. 100 years ago. So I thought that was really, really interesting. Fast forwarding to the Windrush, a lot of people from the Caribbean will know, or it's been popularly characterized that the Windrush was the ship that started post-war mass migration. We'll get into the full seat of that in a minute. But one of the really interesting things is about the Windrush, and I quote from Tony Kushner. Popularly perceived as coming direct from Jamaica to England, the Windrush's route was, in reality, far from straightforward. The ship had come from Australia, and after Jamaica, it visited Mexico, Cuba, and Bermuda. On the way back, it dropped off Polish migrants in Mexico and men from the Gloucester Regiment in Bermuda. So it had, this really winding, meandering path, but has been popularly perceived as just bringing Jamaican men to Britain and giving birth to post-war mass migration. So one of the first great reads in this immigration special is The Battle of Britishness by Tony Kushner. Migrant Journeys from 1685 to the present. The next one, more straightforward. Panikos Panayi, An Immigration History of Britain, Multicultural Racism Since 1800. So a little shorter look, but it really looks again at the way in which, the British public and the British state have reacted since 1800 to migrant peoples. What it gives, there's actually a nice table in here somewhere, but I didn't actually mark it out. There's a good table in here looking at the amount of, there we go, I did mark it out, see? This is looking at migrant journeys to Britain since 1800. So it looks at the groups of people that came before 1945. As you see, before 1945, only about 10,000 people came from Africa. But before 1945, 1.5 million people came from Ireland. Yeah, that's since 1800. Even in the years after World War II, we see 500,000 people coming from Poland. We see 160,000 people come from Italy. We see all different types of people coming to Britain that have to varying degrees been naturalised as British citizens. But this really looks at the way in which racism towards immigrants has manifested, not just in the post-war period, but since 1800. So our second great read is An Immigration History of Britain, Multicultural Racism Since 1800 by Panikos Panayi. My favourite of the three, not because it's the best written, I think Tony Kushner's book is better written as a piece of literature, but because it's the most scholarly and deals with obviously the period that I'm the most emotionally connected to, is Whitewashing Britain, Race and Citizenship in the Post-War Era by Kathleen. And it looks at exactly that, what it really looks at. It takes, 4 different, I've got loads of highlights in this one, I've gone over the top here. I use this a lot for the book that I was writing, Natives. But it looks at the way in which different groups of migrants to Britain were received and dealt with and treated based on skin colour, nothing else. Loads of primary quotes there from the Home Office, Commonwealth Office, Ministry of Labour, and it really goes through the contradictory way in which the British government has managed post-war citizenship based on race. So just so you understand, a little brief outlining. In 1948, the British Nationality Act made citizens of the entire British Commonwealth. So the Caribbeans that came here were citizens. The South Asians that came here in that period were citizens. The Asians that came here in that period were citizens. The Africans that came here in that period were citizens. I don't remember if I said Africans already or not. But anyway, the entire British Commonwealth were citizens of Britain. The moment non-white people started to arrive, the British ruling class, not the public, though they blamed it on the public later, already decided we were foreigners simply because we were not white. I'm not saying that to be horrible. As Kathleen points out in the book, Attlee's post-war government referred to the British Caribbean citizens on board the Windrush, who remember paid for themselves, who were mostly skilled workers, as an incursion, and took steps to identify the ringleaders to make sure such an incursion never happened again. So British citizens exercising the rights inherent in that citizenship by travelling throughout the Commonwealth were apparently an incursion. In that same period of time, in the post-war period, so between 1945 and 1960, the British government paid for 1.5 million domestic British people to go and settle in the white dominions. About 75% of the families could not have afforded to settle if they didn't receive government assistance. So these were working class people, taking state handouts. They didn't pull themselves up by the bootstraps, going to settle in other people's countries and literally take their jobs. So it's quite ironic that we talk about people coming here taking our jobs. What do I mean by that? In many of the places we're talking about, it was illegal for the natives, for the locals, to engage in certain skilled work in areas of European settlement. So people were literally going to other people's countries and having rights and privileges based on skin colour that even the natives did not have. At the same time, in this post-war period, the British government's paying for 600,000 people, just to put that into context. Total migration from the Caribbean from 1945 till now is about 400,000. So 600,000 people to come from post-war Europe, refugees, workers, others from non-English speaking countries, including 25,000 German and Italian literal prisoners of war, to come and settle in Britain and take jobs in Britain and be naturalised as British. So this leaves us today with the absurd situation in which millions of people whose great-grandparents are immigrants to Britain, often immigrants who had their way paid for them, who came from non-English speaking countries, get to call those of us whose grandparents were literally British citizens, so in the case of Jamaica, coming from a territory that was ruled by Britain from before the Act of Union with Scotland, ruled by England from before the Act of Union with Scotland, from 1655, my grandmother comes here as a British citizen, but now we've been turned in the popular imagination into foreigners or immigrants, and people who came from post-war Italy, Germany and Poland have been turned into citizens, based solely on skin colour. What this book really does is outlines the way in which the state did that. Really, really brilliant book, full of, primary source material, direct quotes from ministers in case we think it's any other issue. So the final book, the final instalment in our immigration special is Whitewashing Britain, Race and Citizenship in the Post-War Era by Kathleen. This week's Great Reads has been an immigration special. Happy reading, ladies and gentlemen. Big up.
So read, stuck on the block, read, sitting in the box, read.